In cities across America, there are people who disappear without the world slowing down to notice. No breaking news. No national attention. Sometimes, not even a proper investigation. Families search alone while days quietly turn into months, and months into years. And eventually, many of those names begin to fade. But every once in a while, a single investigation changes everything. A routine police case suddenly uncovers something far larger than anyone expected. Not just a crime, but a pattern. A trail of forgotten victims connected by one disturbing truth. Because the people most easily ignored often become the easiest targets. And in this case, what investigators uncovered inside a series of abandoned houses would force an entire community to confront a question nobody wanted to ask. How many victims were overlooked before anyone finally paid attention? On an empty street in Gary, Indiana, surrounded by collapsing houses and broken windows, police thought they were responding to the murder of one woman. A 19-year-old girl had been found dead inside a motel room. At first, detectives believed the case would end there. One victim. One suspect. One crime scene. But within hours, the investigation changed completely. Because after police questioned the man connected to that murder, he calmly led investigators towards several abandoned houses scattered across the city. And inside those houses, they found bodies. Not one, not two, but multiple women, left hidden in places most people would never enter. Some had been missing for days. Others, for years. Neighbors had walked past those homes every single day without knowing what was inside. And the deeper investigators searched, the more terrifying the picture became. Because many of the victims shared something in common. Most of them had been ignored long before they disappeared. Some struggled with addiction. Some lived alone. Some had unstable housing. Some were reported missing, but their cases never received attention outside their families. For years, their names barely appeared in the news. And now, detectives were standing inside abandoned buildings trying to understand how so many women could vanish without the city realizing a predator had been moving among them the entire time. One officer later described the crime scenes as overwhelming. Dark hallways. Rotting floors. Rooms filled with silence. In one house, investigators had to carefully step around collapsed debris just to reach the back room. That's where they made another discovery. And suddenly, what looked like a single homicide investigation was becoming something much larger. Police soon identified the suspect as Darren Van, a 43-year-old man living in the area. According to investigators, he admitted to killing multiple women and hinted there could be even more victims connected to him. As news spread across Indiana, fear moved quickly through the community. Families of missing women started calling detectives. Some wondered if their daughters had become victims too. Others were terrified because they hadn't heard from loved ones in weeks. And investigators realized something disturbing almost immediately. This case wasn't only about murder. It was about how easily people can disappear when society stops paying attention to them. Several victims were women whose lives rarely made headlines. Some had histories police believed caused their cases to receive less urgency. And that detail sparked anger across the country. Because many people began asking the same question. If these women had come from wealthy neighborhoods, if they had different backgrounds, would someone have noticed sooner? As investigators searched house after house, they uncovered more evidence connecting the killings across multiple locations. The abandoned homes looked forgotten from the outside. Boarded windows, overgrown grass, broken doors. But behind those walls, detectives were uncovering evidence tied to victims whose families had spent years searching for answers. And then came another chilling realization. Police believed the crimes may have stretched back far longer than anyone expected. Investigators in multiple states started reviewing old missing persons cases and unsolved murders, trying to determine whether other victims had been connected to the suspect for years. Suddenly, every cold case felt important again. Every forgotten report. Every unexplained disappearance. Every woman whose story faded too quickly. And while investigators worked through evidence and interviews, another truth slowly emerged. This was not only the story of a killer. It was the story of victims many people failed to protect. Women whose families kept searching even when attention disappeared. Women whose names deserved to be remembered long before police discovered those abandoned houses. But the most disturbing part of the entire investigation came from what detectives discovered inside a room officers almost ignored. At first, detectives believed this was an isolated crime. One victim. One suspect. One abandoned property connected to a murder investigation that seemed straightforward. The kind of case police thought would move quickly once they had someone in custody. But almost immediately, small details began to create bigger questions. Because the house investigators entered didn't feel abandoned in a normal sense. The outside looked empty. Broken windows. Boarded doors. Overgrown grass stretching across the yard. But inside, there were signs someone had been coming and going for a long time. Fresh footprints in the dust. Recently moved furniture. Food containers that didn't look old. And according to investigators, a strange odor that seemed impossible to ignore. Then detectives started speaking to neighbors. And that's when the story became even more disturbing. Several people claimed they had heard unusual noises coming from the property late at night. Loud bangs. Crying. What sounded like arguments. One neighbor later admitted they almost called police months earlier, but convinced themselves it was probably nothing. Another claimed they occasionally saw women entering the area, but rarely saw them leave. At first, investigators weren't sure what to believe. Because the neighborhood itself had already been struggling for years. Abandoned homes lined entire streets. Crime reports were common. And in places like that, people often stopped asking questions just to protect themselves. But then detectives uncovered something they couldn't ignore. Several missing persons reports had originated from areas surrounding those same abandoned houses. Women who disappeared without explanation. Women whose cases received little media attention. Some were labeled runaways. Others were believed to have left voluntarily. And because many of the victims struggled with addiction or unstable housing, their disappearances failed to create urgency outside their families. But now, investigators were beginning to notice patterns. The same neighborhoods. The same time periods. The same unanswered questions appearing again and again. Then came the witness statement that changed the direction of the investigation completely. A local resident told detectives they had seen a man leaving one of the abandoned properties late at night shortly before police arrived at the crime scene. The witness described him as calm. Not panicked. Not rushed. Just quietly walking away into the darkness as if nothing had happened. That detail unsettled investigators immediately. Because by then, detectives were starting to realize this case no longer looked random. And the deeper they searched inside the houses, the more victims they uncovered. Rooms hidden behind damaged walls. Personal belongings scattered across filthy floors. Evidence connecting multiple women to locations police had nearly overlooked. Suddenly, what began as one homicide investigation was turning into something much larger. And somehow, all the clues had been sitting in plain sight. People described him as polite, but distant. Quiet. The kind of person neighbors noticed, but never really knew. He kept to himself. Rarely spoke for long. Rarely invited people inside. And in a neighborhood already filled with abandoned homes and constant police activity, nobody paid much attention to another man trying to stay unnoticed. But over time, small rumors started spreading. Women entering the property late at night. Arguments heard through broken windows. Cars stopping outside the house for only a few minutes before disappearing again. Some neighbors later claimed they felt uncomfortable around him. Others remembered strange smells coming from the property during the summer months. But every concern seemed to fade almost as quickly as it appeared. Because the area had already become used to violence. Used to neglect. Used to people disappearing without answers. And many of the women connected to the case came from backgrounds society often ignored. Some struggled with addiction. Some had unstable housing. Some were labeled runaways before investigations even properly began. Their disappearances rarely made headlines. Families searched mostly alone. And over time, many of those cases quietly went cold. Then came the statement investigators couldn't stop thinking about. One neighbor later admitted, they heard screaming weeks earlier. But they never called police. Not because they didn't care. Because in that neighborhood, people had learned to stay out of things that felt dangerous. And at that point, police still had no idea how deep this case actually went. As investigators continued searching the abandoned houses, the timeline started falling apart. The suspect's story kept changing. He claimed he barely knew the victims. But detectives quickly uncovered evidence suggesting otherwise. Security footage placed vehicles connected to missing women near the properties. Phone records showed repeated contact shortly before several disappearances. And investigators discovered purchases that immediately raised concern. Cleaning supplies. Large amounts of trash bags. Items detectives believed could be connected to the crime scenes. Then came another disturbing discovery. Inside one abandoned house, investigators uncovered a hidden area partially blocked by damaged furniture and debris. Nearby, they found burned documents. Destroyed photographs. Personal belongings scattered across filthy floors. Items that appeared to belong to multiple women. Suddenly, detectives realized they weren't looking at isolated incidents anymore. This looked organized. Careful. Repeated. One detective later described the investigation as overwhelming. Every new piece of evidence seemed to uncover another unanswered question. Then investigators made a discovery even more disturbing. Some possible victims had never officially been reported missing at all. No investigations. No media coverage. No active search efforts. Just people who disappeared, and were never documented. And that raised a terrifying question. how many victims were there really? The deeper investigators looked into the disappearances, the more painful the pattern became. These were women society often overlooked long before they vanished. They weren't celebrities. They weren't national headlines. Most people never even knew their names. One victim was last seen only a few blocks from one of the abandoned properties. Her family repeatedly contacted authorities after she disappeared, but weeks passed without major attention. Another woman had been labeled a runaway almost immediately. But before her phone stopped responding, her family received one final message that didn't sound like her at all. Then there was another victim whose disappearance barely generated a report. No media coverage. No public search. Almost as if she vanished without anyone expecting answers. Families later described feeling abandoned by the system. One relative painfully admitted, "It felt like nobody cared until bodies were found." And as detectives connected more victims to the same locations, the investigation became impossible to contain. Because this was no longer only about one suspect. It was about years of disappearances that had quietly slipped past everyone. And that's when the investigation turned into something far bigger than anyone expected. As investigators continued processing evidence inside the abandoned houses, they uncovered something hidden behind a collapsed section of wall. A small storage area police nearly missed. Inside were old photographs. Dozens of them. Some showed women investigators had already identified. Others showed faces nobody recognized at all. At first, detectives believed the pictures were random. But after studying them closely, they noticed a disturbing pattern. Many of the women had been photographed in similar locations. The same abandoned rooms. The same furniture. The same buildings investigators were now searching. And then detectives realized something even more disturbing. Some of the photographs appeared much older than expected. This wasn't a single incident. It may have been happening for years. Investigators soon reopened older missing persons cases connected to nearby areas. And as they reviewed old reports, more similarities started appearing. Women who vanished under nearly identical circumstances. Investigations that ended too quickly. Warnings that were never fully followed up. Then the case took another unexpected turn. According to detectives, someone close to the suspect may have known more than they admitted. A former associate reportedly told investigators they noticed suspicious behavior long before the murders became public. Late-night visits. Women entering the properties. Strange excuses whenever questions were asked. And according to detectives, someone close to him may have helped keep the truth hidden. By then, investigators were racing to confirm what they feared. DNA evidence connected multiple crime scenes. Phone data placed the suspect near disappearances investigators once believed were unrelated. Witnesses began coming forward. And piece by piece, the entire case started coming together. Until finally, the truth became impossible to ignore. At that moment, investigators realized this crime scene was only the beginning. Police moved in before sunrise. Officers surrounded the property while detectives prepared search teams nearby. Inside the house, investigators found the evidence they had been searching for. Personal belongings linked to victims. Hidden evidence buried beneath debris. Items detectives believed connected multiple murders together. And then came the confession. According to investigators, the suspect admitted to killing several women and hinted there could be even more victims authorities had not yet identified. The investigation quickly expanded across multiple locations. Evidence boards filled entire rooms. Families waited desperately for updates. And as the full scale of the crimes became public, shock spread across the country. Because investigators now believed many of these women had been targeted precisely because they were vulnerable. Easy to overlook. Easy to ignore. The victims hadn't disappeared by accident. They had been forgotten. For years, these families begged for answers. And now, they finally knew the truth. Court hearings became emotional as relatives described years of searching without support. Some cried while reading victim statements. Others spoke about anger toward a system they believed failed to protect vulnerable women. The suspect was eventually sentenced for multiple murders. But even after the conviction, many questions remained unanswered. Could this have been stopped earlier? Were warning signs ignored? How many disappearances were dismissed too quickly? And for many families, justice still felt incomplete. Because no sentence could undo the years their loved ones spent forgotten. The most terrifying crimes aren't always hidden. Sometimes, they happen right in front of everyone. And sometimes the real horror is how easily people can disappear when society stops paying attention. Because if investigators never entered that house, how many more victims would have disappeared? And to this day, some believe there may still be victims nobody has found.